Not for the first time in my life, I'm obsessed with a city builder based on a specific period of ancient history. And I mean like, the first time I played it, I was up until 3 in the morning kind of obsessed. The kind that makes you forget to go and have a wee because you're so fixated on tweaking a supply line or completing that one final objective so you can move on to the next level. It's the kind of game I would have bought from a PC World back in the early 2000s and played for 400 hours over a school holiday. I haven't felt like this for a long time and I absolutely adore it. Nebuchadnezzar is a classic isometric city builder with a focus on resource management and maintaining trade routes. It's heavily inspired by classics in this genre such as Pharoh or Zeus. I think Zeus was the same as Pharoh, right? Basically, it allows you to construct cities themed after the time period in which the game takes place. In this instance, Nebuchadnezzar allows you to rule over the people of ancient Mesopotamia, and let me tell you, this is by far the best game about ancient Mesopotamia I've ever played. Yes, even better than Super Mesopotamia Kart. That's a bad joke. Basic gameplay sees you constructing houses to build up your population before recruiting them to gather a number of resources, such as wheat, milk, fish, clay. Then, these resources can be used to upgrade structures or create additional resources. Wheat, for instance, can be taken to a bakery and then turned into bread. Bread and milk can then be sold in markets to improve houses, which can then hold more workers as a result. Minute-to-minute gameplay isn't too difficult. It has a nice, gentle pace. The difficulty really comes in trying to structure buildings so that they work seamlessly with one another. Anything that generates a resource has to be placed within the vicinity of a warehouse that can store its produced goods. Anything that takes those resources, such as a brick maker that needs the clay, must also have access to that warehouse in order to grab them. With such limited space to work with, the game does allow you to transport goods between different warehouses via caravans, but the majority of your time with the game will be spent fiddling with these supply lines, attempting to work out the most efficient routes and positions possible in order to thrive. It's not quite as intense as something like Factorio, but it's not as relaxing as something like Foundation or The Settlers. This does require a hell of a lot of brain work, especially considering you have such limited space to place things down in, and in that sense it kind of reminded me of a game called Terra Nil that I covered last year. That was as much a puzzle game as it was a city builder as a result of the limited space it provided players with. Also, seen as though Mesopotamia was located in what we now refer to as Western Asia, the ground can only become fertile enough to grow crops if properly irrigated. That means that water wheels must be constructed to aid the flow of water, but water only travels so far, and water wheels can only be placed on certain parts of the map. Are you starting to see where I'm going with this? It's quite complex and space is tight. Because of the limited space, your population primarily has to be expanded by improving houses you've already built, which requires certain resources to be frequently transported to the buildings. Also, some resource buildings can only be operated by workers of a certain social class who live in different houses and require fancier resources and prettier surroundings. And also, you've got to build big temples, because this is ancient Mesopotamia, it's a well-old culture, they loved big temples and that, so get making bricks. All of these disparate components layered on top of each other result in one hell of a fun city builder. But saying that, this isn't a city builder in the sense that the game wants you to build your dream city. Although there are some customizable elements, such as temples or decoration items, which are primarily used to make the surrounding locations of buildings that want to live in pretty areas look a bit nicer. This is mainly a complex resource management game. It's not too complex, it kind of hits that sweet spot that stops things from feeling boring without it being a bit too overwhelming. There's not much fat to be found here. It's a very trim experience. It's all about making sure that you can create a city that runs as efficiently as possible, within some very strict guidelines. You're aided through this task thanks to some great UI features, such as the ability to temporarily run the game at max speed by holding down E, which means that you can gather resources so much quicker at the press of a button, which really does make a huge amount of difference in a game that kind of requires you wait for a bit while your workers gather resources. There's a great set of tutorial levels that slowly introduce the game's core mechanics in a way that just makes sense and doesn't feel too scary. There's a bunch of graphs and visual layers to help you understand issues in your supply chain, and there's even an inbuilt wiki that explains everything in detail in case you need reminding along the way. So even though it features no combat and nothing resembling a catastrophic fail state, you can run out of money, space and workers, but it's not that difficult to kind of tweak a few supply lines to try and get things back on track. This is pretty much still a relatively relaxing experience that's easy to get lost within. Maybe a bit too lost. I think that's probably my biggest issue, is it's one of those games where it just absolutely consumes you, and if you don't get something right that first time, if you've started the level off just incorrectly and your supply chains just aren't working, it's quite frustrating. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I want things to be perfect first time, and maybe games like this rub me up the wrong way in that sense. But I kept coming back, I kept replaying levels to make them perfect, and the feeling when I got that right felt really, really good. I mean, sometimes the maps can feel a bit too small, to the extent that it becomes less of a challenge and more of a stress. There were a few instances where I had to start completely from scratch, even though I'd poured maybe 2-3 hours into a level. It got to the point where I had no space left to place anything down, things weren't working, I'd done something fundamentally wrong early on in that level, and I just had to start from scratch. It's not a great feeling, especially in some of the later levels where the maps are a little bit bigger, but they require you to place down so many buildings and keep everyone happy. It's not that easy. Also, to distribute items to houses in order to upgrade them, you need to build markets, and then you need to set routes for the people that work there so they can cover every house. Setting those routes was a little bit frustrating, especially like 8 hours into the game. It felt a bit too fiddly and didn't really feel that intuitive. I do wonder if it would be better if when you placed a market down, it was a bit like in SimCity or in City Skylines, where it just told you how many houses its sphere of influence would cover. I guess this is where the game felt a bit more like a puzzle game to me, purely because you had to do so much brain work to really work out how you were going to manage all of these individual bits and pieces. I don't know, I found that a little bit tiring, but that might just be me. I know a lot of people love being able to do granular changes like this, so your mileage may vary in that sense. Also, it is worth mentioning that the game features a campaign mode consisting of 14 levels, but seemingly not much else. That's not a bad thing. The levels are pretty chunky, and it took me about 10 hours to get about 3/4 of the way through the game, so there's plenty for you to work your way through. Also, a lot of the marketing for the game talks a lot about how it's built for mod support, so there's a chance that the game will become flooded with user-created maps and custom scenarios in time. But as it stands, in the version I played, I only had access to that campaign mode and nothing else. Still, jumping back to positives, I absolutely loved the game's visuals. It's very faithful to Pharoh, with its massive people that clomber around the streets like the monsters from Attack on Titan, but if they worked for Deliveroo, that's a note I wrote, and that's an awful joke. Why would I write that down in my notes? It does look gorgeous though. All the buildings look really clean and lovely. The soundtrack is superb. Like, the soundtrack is so good to this game. Normally I turn off the music pretty quick and just listen to my own music, but nope, I kept the music on the entire time and had a fantastic time listening to it. It just all feels very polished and very slick. It does exactly what it sets out to do, and it does it really, really well. So I really do recommend this. Nebuchadnezzar is reminiscent of those classic games that you may be familiar with, but it's successful in carving out its own sense of identity. It's just so nice to see this style of game make a long-awaited return, and I already can't wait to spend a few more sleepless nights getting absolutely obsessed building the great cities of Mesopotamia. Anyway, that's just a nice quick review from me. I hope it's helpful. I hope you have fun with Nebuchadnezzar. Please do let me know in the comments if you've played the game and what you think of it. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and maybe subscribe to the channel. It really, really helps me out. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.